And I welcome everyone to Press TV's news review program, where we get in depth in one of the day's top stories. A Canadian indigenous group says that it expects more graves to be found near a former residential school where 215 unmarked graves have already been discovered. The group called on the government and the Catholic Church, which ran that school, to release records to help identify the graves near the Kamloops Indian Residential School. It noted that ground surveying research in areas close to school shows that there could be as many as 200 potential burial sites there. The group added that the number could increase as much of the area has not been surveyed yet. So far, more than 1,100 graves have been discovered at former residential schools across the country. The Canadian government has admitted that physical and sexual abuse was rampant in those schools. Joining us now for the program is Robert Fantina, author and journalist from Kitchener, Ontario, and Jason Unruhe, political commentator, joining us from Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada as well. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Robert, we're going to start with you. Your thoughts about the unspeakable things that may have happened to these children before they met their fate, and then even now, the Canadian government, a lot of people feel, the indigenous people feel that they're not doing enough to survey these pieces of land under suspicion.
It is certainly true that the Canadian government isn't doing enough. It should be doing everything in its power. It should be providing ground-penetrating radar equipment to all the at all the schools, surveying, regardless of how big the property is, how much it is. They should be spending whatever money it takes to find that. These innocent children and their families suffered horrifically. The children were ripped from their families under penalty. There was a law at the time. And then these innocent children were abused physically, sexually, emotionally, separated from their families, separated from their culture, their language, and all this among the most horrendous abuse that one can imagine. The Canadian government can't undo this, but it can do everything possible to find the victims, to aid the survivors. The First Nations people for the horrible things the government did to them. And the Canadian government is not doing nearly all that it should.
Thank you, Robert. And Jason, welcome to the program. It's been a while. Hope you're safe and doing well. Unspeakable what these kids may have gone through. And it's atrocious and it's pretty much disgusting. So why don't we see that or feel or basically, get the idea that there is a sense of urgency when it comes to the Canadian government's response to this or the Catholic Church, Jason?
I think that the reason that this is that the First Nations people don't exactly have the kind of political power in Canada that many other groups do have. I mean, as it stands, probably about 2% of the population of Canada, roughly about there, are First Nations people, and they thus don't wield any significant voting power. So generally in a Western democracy, that kind of political influence is what motivates government to make certain actions, to do certain things that need to be done. I also think that a major part of this is a desire to avoid responsibility for what happened. Obviously, when you have something like this with such terrible crimes being committed, there's a great deal of compensation that needs to be paid out to those who have been harmed. Now, some reparations have been paid out to victims of the residential schools, but this whole finding these mass graves, and I expect many more to continue to be found, are going to be another issue altogether. And I think a certain degree of liability is what the Canadian government is trying to do here. I also think they're trying to do it very, very quietly so that there's as little media attention to this as possible. The thing is that Canada likes to promote itself as being a human rights defender and peacekeepers, not policers, to like to be the good Western democracy as opposed to the United States. But when it really comes down to it, right into the heart, Canada as much as a colonial occupier state as much as the United States is. So I think that there's a degree of not only trying to avoid responsibility, but try to minimize media contact as media attention as much as possible, and I would say this probably the same for the Catholic Church as well.
And Robert, the justification for these schools was that the Canadian government, with the help from the Catholic Church, wanted to help assimilate the indigenous population with the European colonial population. So my question to you, why do they all end up dead? And why is it, according to Jason's point, why is there only 2% of the Canadian population now indigenous?
That's very telling, that only 2% of the population is indigenous. It just shows how successful the Canadian government was in its colonial project in the land that is now Canada. The fact that the population is so
I'm sorry, before, hold on.
Just shows the amount of...
Robert, continue, but what I wanted where did they cross the line where assimilation turned into let's go toward genocide, and why?
Right. I think there was never any question that that's what it was going to be. The indigenous people were not wanted in their own country by the invading colonial rulers, and the idea of assimilation was just an expression for genocide. We're going to get rid of these people. We'll do it this way. The residential schools is one of the methods. We don't want them around. We're going to get rid of them. It's genocide. Studies have determined that this was cultural genocide. It was not just cultural genocide. It was genocide in its major form. It was killing innocent people simply because they were not white.
And Jason, your thoughts on that?
I think that's very much the case. I mean, both the Canadian government and the general society at large saw them as a burden on society. The Canadian government didn't see them as being integrated into society and being a part of everything else that was going on. And I'm sure the Catholic Church saw them as, well, frankly, would see them as heathens for not accepting Christ into their life. And because of that, they were seen as lesser people as a result, which no doubt played a major part in the way that they were treated, not just by the Canadian government and Canadian society in general, but by the Catholic Church as well.
Thank you, gentlemen. Time has gotten the better of us. I want to thank you both for joining us on the program. Stay safe, both of you. Robert Fantina joining us from Kitchener, Ontario, and Jason Unruhe also joining us from Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review program. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye for now.